Welcome to the Cum Laude Post ICANN podcast with updates from the meeting that took place in Puerto Rico between the 3rd and the 7th of March. I'm Stuart Fuller. I'm Cum Laude's TLD Services Director, and I'm joined today by Susan Payne, who's our Head of Legal Policy, Sophie Hay, who's our Policy Advisor, and Ashley Roberts, who's Head of New GTLD Consultancy. And we're here to provide you an overview of some of the key topics discussed at ICANN79 and what some of those key takeaways were. So let's start by looking at some of the key matters discussed at the meeting around policy implementation. Ash, you attended the sessions related specifically to two new policies that will be applied to registries and registrars. Can you briefly explain what they are?
Sure, thanks, Stuart. Um, so the first one relates to DNS abuse, and the other one is about the handling of domain registration data, which people might know as what it used to be referred to as WHOIS information. The DNS abuse policy is actually not strictly a policy at all. It's actually those new rules have actually come through voluntary changes to the registry and registrar contracts with ICANN. Those changes were negotiated throughout 2023 and then voted through by the registries and registrars at the end of last year. The new obligations are designed to provide ICANN's compliance team with more teeth to take action against registries and registrars that don't deal with reports of abusive domains. It had been a concern for a while that the old obligations on tackling DNS abuse weren't fit for purpose and didn't allow ICANN to sufficiently punish bad actors. So these contractual changes that were designed to address that deficiency. The other new policy is known as the Registration Data Policy, and it was created in response to the GDPR and the issues that it created for domain registration data. Essentially, this new policy clarifies the obligations of registries and registrars in processing and publishing domain registration data, while allowing them to adhere to relevant data protection laws. The new policy will replace what was known as the temporary specification, which led to a majority of domain registration data going dark a few years ago when the GDPR became effective. Um, However, this new registration data policy largely reaffirms the substance of the temporary specification, really essentially codifying it in a permanent policy.
Thanks, Ash. So, when are these policies due to come into effect?
So the DNS abuse rules are going to come into effect pretty soon, on the 5th of April. It's a little more complicated for the registration data policy, because a significant amount of implementation work needs to be done first by the registries and registrars. So they need to make changes to their systems. They potentially need to put data protection agreements in place as well. So because of that work that needs to be done, ICANN has allowed approximately 18 months for the registries and registrars to do that implementation work, which means that the new rules for the registration data policy will become effective on the 21st of August 2025, though it is possible that some parties may adopt those rules earlier, if they get their work done a bit quicker.
Okay, so there's a fairly long runway there on that second part to implement those. What do these policies mean for brand holders?
In terms of the DNS abuse changes, they're a good thing for brand holders because they put firmer obligations on registries and registrars to tackle DNS abuse. They're now required to take action where they're provided with actionable evidence of abusive domains. And if they don't promptly take appropriate action on those reported abusive domains, then ICANN will now have the power to investigate and potentially issue compliance notice to the registries and registrars, escalating up to potential breach notice and even taking away a registrar's accreditation if it gets that far. So although the contractual changes on DNS abuse are not really a paradigm shift, it should see an improvement in the experiences of brand holders when they report DNS abuse to registries and registrars. Um, in terms of the registration data policy, it's not likely to have much of an effect on brand holders. So although it's a more robust policy than the temporary specification which it's replacing, the upshot is that registries and registrars are still permitted to redact personal information in terms of registration data to comply with relevant legislation, or where it's commercially reasonable to redact that information. Therefore, we don't really expect there to be much of a change in the level of domain registration data published.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks for that update, Ash. Now let's turn the attention to something that was definitely a hot topic before the meeting, and that's the subject of RDRS. So, Susan, can you remind us again of what RDRS is?
Yes, thanks, Stuart. Yes, so the RDRS, or Registration Data Request System, is exactly that. It's a centralized system that ICANN has developed to help streamline the requests for disclosure of redacted registration data, or as Ashley mentioned, what was formerly known as Who Is Data. And the majority of the requesters that are using that system are brand owners or their legal representatives and law enforcement representatives, although there are some other groups as well who have been submitting requests. Requests are submitted via the system that are then forwarded to participating registrars, and the registrar must then make a determination whether or not there's a legal basis for disclosure of the data. And if there is, then the data is disclosed directly to the requester outside of the system. And although disclosure, as I said, happens outside the system, registrars are expected to update the RDRS to indicate whether the data will be disclosed, or to give a high-level reason for not disclosing. So some of those reasons for not disclosing include that it's not possible to disclose due to applicable law, that more information or other action is required, or that the request fails to comply with some of the RDRS legal terms. And basically, ICANN will be producing monthly reports that will summarize data such as the number of requests that have been received, a breakdown across the types of requesters, a percentage of requests for which disclosure has been made, and breakdowns of the different reasons for refusal.
Okay, so it's been nearly 4 months since RDS was launched. How's the community responding to it?
Okay, well, at the start of the Puerto Rico meeting, the system had been operational, I'd say, for about 3 months, and we'd had 2 of the usage metric reports issued by ICANN. The next one, I think, is probably due to land imminently, that will cover up to the end of February. And based on the reports running up until the end of January, we could see that 75 registrars are participating voluntarily in the system, and that's about 10% of the relevant market of registrars available. But it's understood to reflect more than 50% of the domains under management in the wild. We'd also seen 510 requests submitted, of which 67 requests, or approximately 13%, had been approved for disclosure so far. And it was also reported that for 33 requests, or about 6.5%, the data was already publicly available, which probably relate to domain name registrations that had been made under proxy services. So obviously, understandably, going into the meeting, there was a lot of discussion about those metrics reports and about sort of early experiences in using the RDRS, particularly amongst IP, business and law enforcement participants, and obviously discussion between them and the registrars as well. And I think notably, the commercial stakeholder group organised quite an informative session on requester experiences that was intended to be an opportunity to share feedback, particular practices that have worked well, and sort of discuss some of the early data. And so there's a few takeaways, I think, that came out of that. I would say, whilst a number of the attendees participating in that session were expressing dissatisfaction with the level of disclosure they were receiving, some were a bit more positive, and some were even reporting that the disclosure rate was perhaps even marginally higher than they would have expected to receive if they were requesting the data direct from a registrar. or that they've been expecting to get from the system. One presenter highlighted that they were experiencing quite a wide variation between registrars, so that the registrars they'd been submitting requests to were either giving them no disclosure on any of their data requests, or they were getting 100% of the data requests being disclosed. Another sort of common theme was that I think that at the moment, the reason for the refusal via the RDRS system are not really sufficient to understand why the request has been refused, and what, if anything, could be done to rectify this. And a number of presenters also flagged that many of the domains that they would like the registration data for are with registrars who aren't participating in the RDRS at the moment. And so there was quite a lot of urging of ICANN to try and address that by outreach or by other efforts to get more registrars involved. I think it's also worth noting that both on the the registrar side and on the requester side, there were comments about the system being quite clunky and not terribly user-friendly. So as one example, the character limit for describing the nature of the request was viewed as being inadequate to actually go into detail. And so, you know, to the extent that someone was then getting a response back saying that more information was required, there's that sort of challenge of there's nowhere else to give more information. So hopefully that's something that can get addressed in the relatively near future.
Interesting. Okay, so has RDRS brought any other issues to light?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the key issues that's come to light is that there's really quite a strong feeling amongst the requester community that many of the requests which they've received a response of either that the data is already publicly available or that more information or corrective action is needed, generally that they may probably relate to domains that are registered under a privacy or a proxy service. But I would say that's something of an assumption that's being made because, as I said previously, it's not really possible to tell what the exact reason for a refusal is. And privacy and proxy services operate in slightly different ways, but in both cases, basically, the underlying operator of the domain name isn't readily reflected in the registration data record. And so, you know, a request for data via the RDRS won't necessarily disclose that information, and indeed that's proving to be the case. So we do have some fairly long-standing policy recommendations relating to privacy and proxy services, including for the development of an accreditation program for service providers. But these were put on hold while work was carried out on developing the registration data policy that Ashley was just talking about as now about to go forward for implementation. So with that happening, thoughts are now turning again to whether the privacy proxy services policy efforts can be implemented. And I think really there's kind of a feeling from different parts of the community that some of the recommendations, which are now about 8 years old, are no longer fit for purpose. And so the first step really to resuming this work is that over the coming months we'll need to determine what remains relevant and what can go forward and what needs some more work and needs some more reconsideration in order to do something effective. But I would say that what's called PPSAI, that work on privacy proxy services has, as I say, been on hold for quite a long period of time, and it's been quite a bone of contention, and it's definitely now coming back to the forefront.
Okay, so thanks for that, Susan. What are the next steps for RDRS?
Okay, so we're sort of 3 to 4 months in. It's intended to be a 2-year pilot. It was acknowledged during some of the sessions in Puerto Rico that in order to meet the launch deadline of November 2023, the implementation of some of the aspects of the system was perhaps not optimal. And so I think there's an intention that there should be some iterative improvements as things go forward. And we've got an RDRS steering committee, which is composed of members of the community and ICANN staff. And so I think the plan is that they'll be meeting regularly. They'll consider each monthly report. They'll consider feedback from users. And they will then sort of discuss whether improvements can reasonably be made during the pilot efforts in order to address some of the challenges and the clunkiness that people have been identifying. And then I think really what's important over the coming months is for ICANN to continue to get the word out. I know, for example, that there'll be at least one session during the INTA annual meeting devoted to raising awareness amongst brand owners and their outside counsel. And there'll be a member of ICANN staff present on the panel for that session. It's also obviously important for them to seek to try and get more registrar engagement outside of obviously the 75 who've already signed up. And then I think there's a really important piece which is about requester expectations to be managed. The RDRS isn't a disclosure system per se. You won't get disclosure via the RDRS that you wouldn't have got by going direct to the registrar before it existed. The purpose of the system is really gathering data about demand. And this does really mean that from the requester side, there's going to be time and resource commitment without any guarantee of getting the requested data. But it's for a longer term aim of helping to demonstrate that the level of request requirements. And then I think finally, I guess, as we see people gaining experience, we'll hopefully also see a bit of a better shared understanding between requesters and registrars of which requests are likely to be successful in resulting in disclosure, and what sort of information is needed in order to persuade a registrar to make that disclosure, because they are convinced that there's a legal basis. So I think there's work to be done. It's really early days. There's useful data at the moment, but I think over the coming months we'll hopefully see more of that. And just more communication, more discussion really needed.
Thanks for that update, Susan. RDRS is a really important topic, I think, for brand holders. So it's really good that we're staying on top of that. So thank you very much. Naturally, we're now edging closer to a second UGTLD application round. So can I turn to you, Sophie, and ask what's the update on the timeline and milestones for the second round?
Thanks, Stuart. So it's good news in terms of the overall timeline. We are still on track for April 2026 application window for new GTLD applications. So a big thank you to everyone in the ICANN community and ICANN staff who have been involved and dedicated to keeping that work on track. In terms of some of the other milestones that we can expect and that are coming up, RSP pre-evaluation, so registry service provider pre-evaluation for those who want to get their testing done before the window opens in April 2026. That's expected to open sometime next year in 2025. In other programs that are meant to go ahead before the application window opens, application support. There is currently an RFP for the panel to decide those applications, which is open until April 2024. This time around, the applicant support is different to last time. Instead of running concurrently with the application process and the application support being part of that application, applicants will know ahead of time before April 2026 whether or not they are eligible for that applicant support and whether they need to be looking for alternative funding sources. At the moment, we also have a number of public comments open. So the first iteration of the first chunk of applicant guidebook sections are out for public comment at the moment. So it's the predictability framework, code of conduct, and conflict of interest guidelines. And this also includes those conflict of interest guidelines for vendors and subcontractors. Applicant freedom of expression, universal acceptance, reserved and block names, and geographic names. So relatively uncontroversial sections of that guidebook. We can expect a second public comment, so a second batch that will be happening in September this year, and a third batch in December this year as well. And currently we're aiming to have a final public comment on the whole applicant guidebook in May 2025. So hopefully that final applicant guidebook won't be out any later than December 2025.
Cool, thank you. Thanks for that, Sophie. So There were some interesting discussions, I believe, on the registry voluntary commitments at the meeting as a way to resolve potential applicant objections. Can you give us an overview of that?
So the good news is that applicants will be able to use registry voluntary commitments to resolve objections they might have against their application in the next round. At a high level, the board has adopted resolutions allowing this to happen in the next round, which is great. So the discussion and consultation now is about establishing guardrails around what kinds of registry voluntary commitments ICANN will be able to accept given ICANN's bylaws. A little bit of detail on this, I won't go into too much, but ICANN's mission provides that ICANN is not allowed to regulate content or services that use the internet's unique identifiers or any content that such services carry or provide. So it's quite a big chunk that's outside ICANN's remit, and ICANN is really meant to be focusing on the identifiers. However, we don't have any such definitions of content anywhere in the ICANN bylaws. So realistically, we're going to be looking at the kinds of policies that are described elsewhere in ICANN's bylaws that will be useful as the type of registry voluntary commitments that ICANN will be willing to accept. So for instance, eligibility criteria for registrants, where there's a nice tidy list that ICANN can check whether someone is on or not. String selection criteria, for instance. So are there any particular rules around how you select the domain name you're interested in? And additional dispute resolution mechanisms. So are there any additional appeals processes that you might want to go through afterwards? So we're probably looking at those types of policies that will be accepted as registry voluntary commitments in the next round.
And finally, it would be remiss of me not to ask, what are the outstanding issues between now and the application window opening?
Well, the good news is that this list is getting shorter and shorter. A small team plus, which has included our own Susan Payne, has been revising some of the recommendations that the board has not yet adopted. So for instance, for DotBrands, instead of it being automatic for DotBrands to be exempt from monitoring obligations for DNS abuse in their space, that instead is going to be an application that they need to make to ICANN to request. It's not automatic, but also importantly, if you request that in your application, it's not and don't get approved for it, that's not impacting your overall application. On applicant support, moving away from language that was specifying certain fees to be paid in addition to application fees, but instead clarifying that ICANN will be providing a wide range of support to applicants to cover the costs. String similarity is still a topic that we're working on. There's currently some guidelines or draft guidelines out for public comment on string similarity. Originally, the recommendation, policy recommendations for the next round said no singulars and plurals unless there's a difference in the intended use. That's been tweaked a little bit because ICANN was concerned about whether that intended use would fall outside of its remit. So this has been modified a little bit so that it's no singulars and plurals in the same language / script. So you're not looking at translations necessarily here. However, there is still that carve out that if one of the strings is a dot brand, then both of the singular plural can proceed. We've also removed the requirement for ICANN to reject an application in certain circumstances, instead making it so that ICANN can reject that application. So again, giving ICANN a little bit more discretion there. And finally, we've removed some of the detail on challenges available to applicants in the next round. So there is still plans to be an appeals process, but there is less detail in that recommendation that's been passed, that revised recommendation that will be passed along to the ICANN board. So in terms of next steps, the ICANN board will consider the revised recommendations. and assuming that those revised recommendations are adopted, they'll move into implementation along with all the other recommendations that we're busy adopting, some of which are currently out for public comment.
Thank you, Sophie. So the second round does seem to be inching closer and closer, which is very exciting, and we look forward to getting more updates on that over the next few months. So that's it. Thank you very much for joining us, and a big thank you to Ash, Susan, Sophie for the updates from ICANN79. We'll be back with a review of the key topics and discussions from ICANN80, which is the policy meeting due to take place in Kigali in Rwanda in June. If you have any additional questions or want to discuss anything around the DotBrand or TLD world, please contact us at info@cumlaude.com. And if you want to hear more from Cum Laude, you can subscribe to our podcast through Apple, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.